Shalom. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, whose name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, whose name is Yahweh Shai. And double honors to my elders and teachers in Great Millstone, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of faith and truth in them as well. My name is Zachariah. Hear my speech concerning the truth, that is the word of the living God. This is an impromptu, a press the button lesson. Nothing prepared, no scripture prepared, that is. But I have news reports, and intel that I could use to edify, and ultimately warn the sheep of the Lord's elect. It is reported, well, first and foremost, we are in a time of prophecy, a time where the effect of that which is written, of prophetic visions, of scriptural prophecy will be felt. And we are in those times. Ultimately, everything done in measure, prophecy set in a particular season and time, but we are, in that motion of, prophecies in general, in their proper order being fulfilled. We are in that inevitable direction ultimately. And that always been the case. We have always been in that direction. It's being reported that the U.S. Army have bombed the Iraqi army, and we know that ultimately that Iran will have to join forces with other nations, with, the dragons of Arabia, Arab nations and militias, in war against America. And this is prophecy, this is documented or declared, shall I say, in the book of 2nd Esdras, chapter 15. So you're going to have, your alliances, the opposing side of America, ultimately, being overshadowed by, Russia, which Russia will be basically that nuclear umbrella, in this war against America, ultimately. It tells you in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, that Russia will be a guard, onto these different nations. So, the time shall come ultimately where Iran will join forces and shake hands with these other nations ultimately. Another thing that's, very, huge announcement. America's deploying troops, their most elite kill squad, allegedly, to the Middle East. I think about, the number is to, 3,000 airborne troops, basically. And this shows you that there's an advancement, in this conflict. There's an uptick in this conflict that's just going to continue, which this is not the end, as Yahweh Shai said. This is not the end. All these things must come to pass. But this is not the end. Which what we're seeing is the necessary steps to the end, ultimately. Such as nation going against nation, rumors of war, of world war, and earthquakes in diverse places, and famine and pestilence, which we're seeing famine coming down the pipe ultimately due to this energy crisis, and economic struggle. And also these fearful sights and great signs in the sky, these are prophetic as well. People reporting throughout America and Europe, fireballs, they're calling it, meteors, and chariot sightings. So this is all prophetic. We're seeing omens of the coming in of the beginning of sorrow, and this is what we're seeing, the beginning of sorrows and evils. So America deploying troops, it's an uptick, and ultimately the time shall come where a draft will be implemented. In fact, from there, I want to go to the book of Revelation, chapter 6. It says, and when he had opened the second seal, verse 3, Revelation chapter 6, verse 3. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword, and that red horse, and him that's sitting upon that red horse symbolizing, Edom, a people whom ultimately is predestined to be destroyed and whom the Lord hates. But they have a very important role, concerning, the chaos and the confusion and conflict that will take place on the planet Earth in these last days. Just like he did with World War I and World War II, ultimately. This is a people who is terrible, in other words, causing terror and strife, causing trouble, in other words. And so will he, in these last days, ultimately taking peace from the earth. Making different, military and political decisions and actions, that will ultimately prompt more conflict, prompt more violence, ultimately. Basically being his old usual anti-peace, and order and national harmony. That's his usual role that he take. So ground war is coming, as being announced. It says the U.S. is preparing to deploy elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, an elite force built for rapid assault and seizing key targets. At the same time, thousands of Marines are moving into position. Warships are stacking up across the region. 50,000 plus U.S. troops already in theater, and 9,000 strikes plus strikes. Says this still isn't over. Here's the reality: the air power weakens the enemy, but it doesn't secure territory. That takes boots on the ground. So boots on the ground soon enough. In fact, let's go to Salaki. Well, we could get this. This is Psalms chapter 73, verse 18. It says, surely thou didst set them in slippery places, thou castest them down in destruction. And really, the Middle East will be the slippery place where America, along with its troops, ultimately will be destroyed. Basically failure is the Middle East for America. And this is inevitable. In fact, what the scripture says in the book of Habakkuk, let's get that real quick. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "Yea, also because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home." So Edom, he don't keep at home. And that's basically the spirit that America have, involving itself in other lands and in the matters of lands, and, dealing unjustly with other lands. Basically, not keeping at home. So, this is, ultimately a form of pride. It says, "Who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied. But gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people." And ultimately, the purposes or the agenda behind it is, surrounding Israel. There are different plans for greater Israel. Further boundaries and more control and sovereignty over lands and heritages. Ultimately, this is the pride of Edom and the pride of Amalek. It says, "Shall not all these take up a parable against them?" And that word parable goes into a taunting sentence. A sentence of reproach, basically. "Shall not all these take up a parable against them, and a taunting proverb against them, and say, Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his, how long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay." Now that word thick clay in the Hebrew ultimately translates to depth, great depth, and that's what America is in, great depth, and it's not able to get itself out of. It says, "Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for beauties unto them?" So ultimately there's going to be, opposition. It says, but yeah, so World War, in fact, let's just end it all with this real quick. Let's get this real quick. Revelation chapter 11, verse 14, it says, "The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly." So the third woe representing World War, the third World War. So this is all, coming to fruition, the Lord's purposes. I'm close off on that. Lord willing, this lesson's edifying. I'm going to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh B'Ashem Yahweh.